Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're doing something really important. We are bringing together some of the most absolutely critical documents that are shaping our immediate future. We're going to synthesize the stark warnings from the IPCC's Sixth Assessment Report, the UN's specific projections for 2026, the cascading threats to our global food security, and a super fascinating World Bank report on the strategic power of indigenous knowledge. It's kind of like a giant puzzle, and we're pulling all these pieces into one clear, interconnected picture of exactly where we stand, what's at risk, and most importantly, how we can move forward. Okay, let's dive right into our roadmap for today. We've got 5 stops. 1, the undeniable climate reality. 2, the global food security threat. 3, impacts on vulnerable communities. 4, indigenous knowledge as strategy. And finally, 5, the 2026 path forward. Starting with Section 1, the undeniable climate reality. We're looking at the hard science and the historical data behind our warming planet. The data here brilliantly illustrates the reality of our warming planet, specifically across different generations. Between 2011 and 2020, global surface temperatures already hit 1.1 degrees Celsius above the 1850 to 1900 baseline. Think about the generation born in 1950 and compare that to a kid born in 2020. The compounding impacts of extreme heat, heavy rain, and rising sea levels. Well, it basically means a child born today is going to experience a fundamentally hotter, much more volatile world than any generation before them. The science here is totally unequivocal. Human influence is absolutely driving this. 2,400 gigatons of carbon dioxide. I mean, that is a massive, almost unimaginable number. It represents the historical, cumulative net CO2 emissions pumped right into our atmosphere from 1850 all the way to 2019. But here's the vital thing to understand from the IPCC data. This massive number, it didn't originate equally. It stems from heavily unequal historical and ongoing contributions. We're talking about unsustainable energy use, land use changes, and wildly different consumption patterns across various regions. Some countries contributed the lion's share, while others contributed just a tiny fraction. Yet, we all share the exact same atmosphere. Bringing this right up to the present day, the latest World Meteorological Organization update, which was recently highlighted by the UN, warns that the period from 2025 to 2029 could actually see temperatures up to 1.9 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial levels. That is a really sharp escalation in risk. It essentially means a 1.5 degree overshoot is highly likely, which is going to intensify heat waves, droughts, and ocean heating in the very, very near future. Moving on to Section 2, the global food security threat. This is all about how these climate shifts are destabilizing our food supply chain. What's really interesting about this is how it shows the threat to our food systems isn't just isolated to one single sector. We are literally looking at a multi-front war. Heat and drought are severely weakening our staple crops, things like wheat, rice, and maize. And, at the exact same time, marine fisheries, which billions of people rely on, are being seriously damaged by ocean acidification and warming. And on land, livestock productivity is dropping because of severe heat stress and a spike in disease outbreaks. Agriculture requires stable, predictable climate conditions, and those patterns are just rapidly dissolving. This brings us to a really critical geopolitical point, perfectly captured by the Khmer Times. Food security is one of the greatest pillars of global stability. And it's so true. When harvests fail in major producing regions, international food prices spike. So this isn't just an agricultural issue, right? It is a full-blown economic and national security issue. Food shortages threaten peace, they threaten public health, and they can literally reverse decades of hard-won progress in reducing global hunger. All right, Section 3, impacts on vulnerable communities. We're looking at the unequal distribution of climate risks and mortality. The IPCC estimates that between 3.3 and 3.6 billion people currently live in contexts that are highly vulnerable to climate change. Just to put that into perspective, that is nearly half the human population. Half the planet is living in areas where development constraints, poverty, and climatic hazards all crash together, placing them in immediate, daily danger from acute food and water insecurity. And this brilliantly illustrates the core inequality of the whole crisis. Developing nations, small island states, and vulnerable communities contributed the absolute least to those 2,400 gigatons of historical emissions we talked about earlier. Yet, they're the ones facing the highest risks. The IPCC explicitly notes that between 2010 and 2020, human mortality from floods, droughts, and storms was a staggering 15 times higher in highly vulnerable regions compared to places with very low vulnerability. Now, in response to this, at least 170 countries have actually included adaptation in their climate policies. But the data reveals this massive implementation gap. Basically, there's a huge widening disparity between the estimated costs of protecting these vulnerable communities and the actual money being allocated to do so. The pledges, they look great on paper, but the actual global financial flows are completely insufficient to implement the real-world adaptation options we need. Section 4. Indigenous Knowledge as Strategy. Utilizing intergenerational wisdom for global resilience. So, the crucial point here is really understanding what Indigenous and local knowledge, or ILK, actually represents when we talk about climate change. As defined by the World Bank, this isn't just about preserving cultural heritage, although obviously that's super important. ILK is a formal, intergenerational, place-based knowledge system. It contains incredibly valuable, time-tested information about local environments and climate variability. According to the World Bank, it is formally recognized as a highly effective, strategic resource for global climate resilience. So how do we actually use it? Well, integrating ILK means applying a bottom-up approach that provides a much-needed counterbalance to top-down global policies. By utilizing ILK, policymakers can dramatically improve local climate assessments because, let's face it, Indigenous communities have generations of direct observational data. This approach allows for the development of targeted mitigation techniques and builds hyper-local adaptation capabilities, like sustainable land management and agroforestry. It's all about working with natural processes rather than against them. And finally, Section 5, the 2026 Path Forward, Key Multilateral Milestones and Necessary Transitions. Let's move to the international calendar and see how this all builds together. 2026 is shaping up to be a completely pivotal year for UN multilateral summits. In August, COP17 in Mongolia is going to tackle land degradation. Then in October, COP17 in Armenia focuses on biodiversity. And wrapping up the year, COP31 in Turkey will center entirely on climate implementation. Even though these operate under different frameworks, the UN emphasizes that they're intrinsically linked. You simply cannot solve carbon emissions without also addressing land degradation and biodiversity loss. It's all connected. Now, at COP31 in Antalya, a massive focal point is going to be negotiating the implementation of the $1.3 trillion goal for climate finance for developing nations by 2035. Remember that implementation gap we talked about earlier? Well, this $1.3 trillion target is the multilateral attempt to actually bridge that gap. It's about providing the absolute crucial funding needed to build real resilience in the world's most vulnerable communities. Another huge focus in 2026 will be the World Urban Forum in Baku. Cities account for a staggering 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. 70%. This makes urban areas the absolute prime targets for deep decarbonization and sustainable transition. More and more, cities are having to step up and fill the gaps left by national policymakers, which makes local and urban execution of these climate strategies more important than ever before. Finally, we have to look at the state of international scientific collaboration. The UN University notes that the United States' decision to withdraw from the IPCC and IPBES represents a significant setback for global scientific efforts. Disengagement like this essentially deprives the public and policymakers of credible guidance. Because of this, the UN stresses that in 2026, it is absolutely essential for the global community to reaffirm its commitment to shared knowledge and scientifically grounded information. Which really leaves us with this final, provocative question. Can the global community successfully merge trillion-dollar international finance with hyperlocal indigenous knowledge before we blow past the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold? The stakes literally couldn't be higher, spanning from our global food supply right down to the survival of vulnerable populations worldwide. The roadmap for 2026 is clear, but the implementation, that's up to us. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it brought some clarity to these complex, critical issues. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.